It's 7:26. We have breaking news for you. As expected, actually, the energy giant BP has just announced it's tripled its underlying profits, tripled them in the last quarter after it benefited from soaring energy prices. Between April and June this year, BP earned nearly £7 billion in profit. That's its highest in 14 years.
In the same period, Shell made profits of nearly £10 billion, the company's highest ever earnings.
Meanwhile, Centrica, that's the owner of British Gas, announced operating profits of £1.3 billion. That's a five-fold increase from this time last year.
Well, we're joined by Shadow Minister for Climate Change, Kerry McCarthy. What do you make of this profits? Because you know what everyone watching is going to think. They're going to think, hang on a minute, they're making all that money and I can't afford to pay my bills, heat my home when it gets chillier and cook my dinner.
Well, exactly. They're doing very well out of the current situation, aren't they? And I have to say, I am just really quite worried about the impact this is having on my constituents. And I'm sure this is the same picture across the country. The predictions as to the next rise in energy bills in October and then again in January are really quite scary. We're talking about maybe £3,600, and people just can't afford that. People are really struggling right now. They've already made the sacrifices. They've had that choice between heating and eating, and there's just nowhere for them to go.
Two-word question: windfall tax?
Yeah, well, Labour pressed very hard for the windfall tax, and Rishi Sunak, it has to be said, fought it tooth and nail, but eventually did introduce one. But what he's done is actually then countered it with an investment allowance for these companies. So if they invest in new oil and gas, which isn't what we should be doing, we should be investing in renewables, they'll actually get about £4 billion back in terms of that tax relief. So Labour's certainly calling for that to be scrapped and for the windfall tax to be backdated to January, which is when we first suggested it.
One campaign group, Don't Pay UK, is organising an energy strike, effectively, where households won't pay energy bills. Just say enough's enough, we can't do it, we're sending out a clear message. What's your message to them and to anybody feeling like they want to join that?
Well, I worry that it will just increase anxiety for households. I think what we really need is a solution so that they can afford to pay their energy bills. Labour's calling for an immediate...
No, obviously, we do need that, but and you can make your point about what they're calling for. But what's your message in terms of no one's listening, we haven't got enough, this campaign group does, if we stop paying the energy bills, people will listen. What's your message specifically to them?
I would say to them that people are actually listening, and that's why we're coming forward with these proposals. And what we're actually finding is a lot of people are self-disconnecting already. So people on prepayment meters, for example, are just saying, I can't afford to keep putting money in the meter. We're going to have to do without any fuel at home. So people are starting to do that. I wouldn't advise for them to go down that path because, as I said, we are listening to them. We're calling for scrapping of VAT on energy bills as an immediate measure, but we also need an emergency budget from the government so they can come forward with a full package of proposals so that people can afford to pay their bills.
In terms of the windfall tax, or an expansion of the windfall tax, as you just described it, I mean, you might be kicking at an open door there because only a few months ago, before the windfall tax was introduced, BP was saying openly they were happy to pay it. They thought it was a good idea at the time. But you know what the deeper arguments against windfall tax are? And they are that obviously energy companies go through peaks and troughs. At the moment, they're at a massive peak, but they will undoubtedly, because that's the pattern, they will dip into a trough. And they say it's in the bad times, when they don't make money, that they need to basically have the storage of the money that they make now to pour into the system and to support it. What do you say to that argument, that actually profits are put back into the system, they are put into research and development, they are put into developing alternative sources of energy?
Well, I think you already answered that question at the very start of you asking me it, Richard, in that you said that the bosses were quite relaxed about this. And I think they do accept that in the current situation, the way this appears to the public is absolutely, it seems immoral to the public that they are making such excessive profits. We've seen that these are, with BP today, the highest profits for 14 years. we are all in this together. That is, you know, I think they have their part to play in terms of helping people get through this cost of living crisis. So, of course, it's not just the energy bills. We're seeing rising inflation across the piece. We're seeing food prices going up. We're seeing pay being held back. And I think they have their role to play.
All right, thank you.
Well, let's speak to Andy Mayer now, who I hope is still there. We may have just lost him. He's an energy analyst from the Institute of Economic Affairs and independent think tank, which receives donations from BP. So you've been honest about that. BP are going to be somebody that you're friendly towards, I'm guessing, because you receive donations from them. But from us looking on, sky-high profits from BP. The question is, why do we need such sky-high prices at the pump?
OK, so at the pump and BP's profits are not connected in any sensible way. The main reason we have high pump prices is we have some of the highest levels of fuel duty in the world. So nearly half of what you pay at the pump is
So if we reduced our fuel duties in the way that Germany and Italy and many other countries have, we wouldn't be paying such high prices at the pump. It's very clear to you, is it?
Absolutely. That's a straightforward way to get the cost of a tank of petrol down. And the cost at the moment is at a record high. So that is something the government could do tomorrow and potentially will do when there's regime change after the leadership election. OK,
so what about energy in the home that we use? Why is that so expensive?
Different story. So energy in the home is about the gas price, not about the oil price. And in the gas price, it's a regional price that's mostly being driven by the conflict in Ukraine at the moment. And that's not something, again, that's in the control of the energy super majors any more than it's in the control of European governments at the moment. What they're all doing is looking around to try and find new sources of gas supply. And that, in the short term, can only come from trade deals, preferably outside Europe.
Well, in the short term, it is quite clear from these figures and from the expected price rises as we go into the winter, let alone the existing price rises, that something's got to give. And what we've just heard is that something should be a windfall tax. What's your view on that?
I think Kerry was all over the shop on this. I mean, there are 3 windfall taxes on the North Sea already, the third one being introduced this year. This brings our tax levels up to near record highs. You have to go back to the 1980s to get anything similar. And we went through this process last time. There was a spike in the oil prices. George Osborne and Gordon Brown experimented with pushing these windfall taxes up. And what happened was a complete collapse of investment in the North Sea, which is exactly what you don't want to happen if you're struggling to find new sources of supply.
So what did you think?
What we would expect to see, and I appreciate what Bernard Looney said at the start of the windfall tax debate, but his company then reversed that position and said we would have to look at its investments. And both they and Shell are saying we're going to invest about £37 billion over the next 10 years in the United Kingdom. And clearly, if these taxes keep rising and those investment allowances do not keep up with them, as Kerry seemed to be suggesting the Labour Party would undermine, then we've got a problem because we're not going to have domestic supply.
So what did you make of the screams of outrage at the weekend? There were screams of outrage across the board at the fact that a dividend was being paid out to shareholders in the energy companies. There was real anger about that. What did you make of that?
Well, companies who have shareholders pay dividends when they're profitable, and the shareholders own the companies. So they are doing their fiduciary duty. That's not something that you should be getting morally excited about. It's something that just happens as a result of the system of operations we have with investment coming in from all over the world. So those will be everything from British pension funds through to people who want to invest their dividends into renewable energy, for example. So let's hope that those investments are made wisely.
It doesn't feel right to people, though. That's the problem, isn't it? It doesn't feel right. It feels like they're bearing the pain for a service that they have, that the energy companies are providing, that they have no choice to use.
Well, I appreciate that. And at the moment, we're all looking at a cost of living nightmare, which is rising prices across the board, driven by an energy crisis that very little can be done to solve in the short term. What we've got to do is look at the long term. And in the long term, we want people investing in Britain. We want them to be paying taxes in Britain. And BP's taxation report in this quarterly 2 announcement has doubled. That's great news. The May review of the figures suggested that BP's North Sea tax would increase by 8 times as a result of simply the increasing oil price. That was before the windfall tax had full impact. So we are getting a benefit from this, and it's for the government to decide what it wants to do with that, and for the government to decide what operating environment it wants to encourage these companies to keep investing in Britain, so that we should be a global exporter of oil and gas, not being dependent on the Belgians to bail us out in the middle of the summer, which is what happened last week.
And there ends, I'm afraid, the case for the defence from Andy Mayer, energy analyst from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you for your time this morning. Thank you.